Hey guys, we are going to do the second video of these helpers, and we are going to go to France because I know where some of us were confused in France. They start immediately with a crisis. King Henry II dies. He has four young sons. They're all terrible rulers. So really, behind the scenes, his queen Catherine de Medicis is running the country. And the other problem going on in France is the drama between the Catholics and the Huguenots. Remember, the Huguenots were the French Protestants. And in 1572, there's a massacre, a slaughter of Huguenots. Because these four sons die, and because Catherine de' Medici dies, Henry IV becomes the king. And he's the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. It's interesting. He is technically a Huguenot, and part of the reason this slaughter was able to happen here is because many of the important Huguenots were in France for his wedding. But once he becomes king, he declares I'm Catholic. He famously says, Paris is well worth a mass, oui, oui. In other words, having this much power is worth changing religions. But because he's a Huguenot and has that tradition, he declares the Edict of Nantes, which basically declares religious toleration in France. You can't beat up Huguenots anymore. Huguenots are allowed to open their own churches, and he rebuilds his nation. After these four clowns are done, he takes over and really rebuilds his nation. He's very dependent on advisors for financial and political advice. And the ironic thing of all irony, or tragic, however you want to say, he gets killed. Why does he get killed? A basically religious fanatic said, "Ooh, I don't like your ideas. Die." So Louis XIII becomes the king, and he has an advisor named Cardinal Richelieu. Henry's son was wimpy, 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 but Cardinal Richelieu was hefty, 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 hefty. Richelieu was religious and ambitious. They actually do a little art study about him on page 163. First thing he says is Huguenots can build cities, but the cities can't have any walls. He does the same thing for the nobles. They can build castles, but they can't be fortified. That way, they can't mess with the king, and the king can mess with them. What Richelieu also realized is all the rulers around him were members of the Habsburg family. And he saw that as a real threat. Holy cow, I'm the only guy not in this gang. I'm going to be in trouble. And he wanted France to be number one, and that's why he got involved in the 30 Years' War. He's going to use France's money to beat down the Habsburgs. Beat Habs. All right? During this time period, there's a type of writing that takes off in France called skepticism. After years of war over religion, who's right, who's wrong, who's got the right Jesus, and political turmoil, who's got the power, which son is smart, which son is dumb, the idea of skepticism is this, that nothing can be known for 100% certain. It even leads to doubting the church. And the idea was, if you challenged an old idea, it led to a new idea. New ideas led to the better world. You get two famous writers here. This idea that one idea replaces another, one that still reflects with us. And thanks to Descartes, we have a system. He's the guy who, in fact, invented the scientific method. Let's have a way of deciding what ideas are better or not. So here we go. Louis XIV. X is 10. I in front of the V means 1 minus 5, or 1 from 5, 4. So you got Henry IV and Cardinal Richelieu. What they did, Louis XIV is going to build on. Louis XIV basically says, I am the state. In other words, he is France and France is him. He became the king at 4 years old. So he has an assistant named Cardinal Mazarin, who ended the 30 Year War famously, put the taxes way up, and got central power back to the state, to the government, to France. And that makes the nobles mad. They're like, no, no, no. The nobles get mad, they have riots. And because these riots were bloody and vindictive, ooh, ready? I'm going to make the, ready? Ooh, nice. Let's see if I got that font on here. Ooh, prepared to be impressed. I don't have chiller on here, do I? All right, we'll do that. The riots were so bloody, it made Louis XIV hate the nobles. Why did the nobles fail? I'm glad you asked. They had no leadership. Not only did they not trust the king or the cardinal, they didn't trust each other. The government, with a pretty strong army, because of all the money they had, they were able to react pretty violently. And partly because the nobles couldn't get anybody to help them. All right? So the lower classes get fed up and they kind of side with the king. And in fact, they say, give us a king. So he's the king, he takes over, and he takes over full power when the cardinal dies when he's 22. It's almost perfect timing. He does some things, Louis XIV does some things to get the nobles' powers down. He would have hundreds of nobles just waiting to help him dress. Every day he'd pick 4. They'd get the honor of helping him dress. Lesser nobles would hang around Paris, hoping that Louis XIV would just look at them like that was a blessing. The power of the government officials went up. These government officials were called intendants, people who worked for him. And what's interesting is by making all of the nobles live in Paris, he did something that should remind us a little bit about what we talked. Ooh, wait, edit, undo. In Japan, he made them depend on him, and he took them from their seats of power. So they couldn't be in their hometown getting powerful. They had to be in Paris trying to look for a chance to, how do I put this gently? Kiss his tokas, all right? Louis XIV's got a lot of style. He builds the Palace of Versailles. It is very luxury. It is super, super fancy. Look at the pictures in your book. It's amazing. He uses the advice of Jean-Baptiste Colbert to rebuild the economy. They encourage manufacturing. Interesting, when Colbert dies, Louis XIV ends the Edict of Nantes, and because of that, all the skilled workers leave France, because many of the skilled workers were Huguenots and Protestants. Edict of Nantes says we should be religiously tolerant. Well, if you're not going to be religiously tolerant anymore, those people could die. He did famously support the arts. He bought a lot of it to put into Versailles. He made a bunch of mistakes. His most important severe mistake was, I would almost argue, building the Palace of Versailles, but he did get in a ton of wars. He fights in the Netherlands and he gets a whopping 10, 12 towns. Again, the Dutch open the floodgates again. He keeps fighting. Eventually, the powers in Europe create an anti-France alliance. And basically what happened is all of the other countries in the world combined could have as much power as France did, and that equals trouble for him because he couldn't win. They kept fighting and kept fighting. Then those years where they kept fighting, there were some poor harvests because they needed more money. There were new taxes. And eventually France gets very upset. The French people are fed up. They're like, what is this guy doing? So you know what he does? Louis XIV gets himself involved in another war. This war is called the War of Spanish Succession. And what happens is the Spanish king dies. Louis XIV puts his son, 16-year-old boy, on the throne. So now Spain and France, 2 old enemies, are under control of the same family. The rest of Europe's like, hell no, because their fear is that if Spain and France have the same family, eventually they could become one country, they could dominate Europe. So basically everybody else in Europe is like, starts playing Eye of the Tiger. They're like, no, we're not going to let this happen. 13 years later, they're fighting, death, fighting, death, fighting, death, fighting, death. Eventually, his son does stay on the throne in Spain, but as part of the peace treaty, France and Spain cannot unify their thrones. This war, again, is called the Spanish Succession, and most historians would say that Britain wins because of the land and the trade power they get. Louis XIV, on his deathbed, realizes he messes up. It's like men, we realize we mess up right before we die. His death actually led to parties in France. People are like, yay, ding dong, is dead. All right. What was good about him? He increased France's power. He oversaw a huge art boom in France. He got France a lot of colonies, which got them a lot of money. Everybody was happy. What was bad? Ooh, don't do that. What was bad was the wars. All right. The wars plus Versailles led to a ton of debt, and that debt, that hatred of the government, distrust of the government, is eventually going to lead to one of our units called the French Revolution. All right, very good, guys. That is 5 point. Peace out, too.